Hi, everyone. We're just giving folks a moment to join us and we will get started very soon. Welcome, everyone. As you're logging on, we're just waiting for a few more people to join us and we will get started momentarily. Okay. Hi, friends. Welcome. My name is Ruth Zachrin. If you do not know me, I am the CEO of the Massachusetts Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence. And we are very excited today to be joined by Greg Jackson and Rob Wilcox from the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention. And we're just getting everyone situated now. I'm going to do a couple of housekeeping things before we get started with our program, and also try to find Greg and Rob on my screen. But welcome, everyone. If you're not familiar with the Massachusetts Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence, we're very excited to have you join us today. We are a statewide organization with over 120 member organizations working to address gun violence in all its forms through policy change, sustained investment in community-based solutions, and building coalition to build power to address gun violence in all of our communities. We are super excited to be joined by Greg Jackson and Rob Wilcox today for a conversation about their work at the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention. And just a couple of housekeeping issues. I know that Greg and Rob have a hard stop at 12:45, so we're going to dive into our content pretty immediately. But we did want to let folks know that we are recording this program today. And so you'll be able to access that recording afterwards. Hello, welcome, Rob. And a couple more housekeeping issues before we get started. We are going to be excited to take questions from everyone in the audience, and feel free to put your questions in the chat and we'll be collecting them as we go along. We suspect we'll have a lot of questions. So Angelica from our team will be helping us keep track of the questions, possibly combine them into themes if we have too many to answer in our time. But we'll do best to get to all of the content today. And I want to welcome Rob Wilcox from the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention. We're so glad that you're able to spend time with us here. And I see that Greg is just coming into the meeting now, so he'll pop up on your screen momentarily. But we're very grateful to both of you for taking the time to be with us today. So we're just going to give Greg a moment to get into the space and get settled.
So Greg will join us for the Q&A. He's got to just jump on something else real quick. So you're stuck with just half of the dynamic duo.
Incredible. So then in that case, I will take a moment to say welcome to you, Rob. We're really so glad that you can be with us to share about your work. And you have a long history of being involved with the work of gun violence prevention. So I would love if you could share a little bit about your background and what brought you here, and then maybe launch into the work of the office.
Yeah, I'd be happy to start there. And Ruth, thank you so much for this invitation and for the opportunity to talk to this great group. I see a bunch of friends, including Christine from the Massachusetts State Office of Gun Violence Prevention, run out of the Attorney General's office. And it's wonderful to see her and so many others. But To your question, Ruth, I've been involved in this space indirectly on gun policy since right around the time when my cousin was shot and killed back in January of 2001. It feels so long ago, but for those of us who've experienced gun violence or seen it firsthand, we know that those experiences don't leave us. And every time I see my aunt and uncle, the pain, the kind of just deep and resounding pain is right there under the surface. And I could see her funeral, like it was yesterday. But I could also see in myself the kind of commitment I made then after having grown up in Brooklyn, New York, and seeing gun violence happen to other people, but not to my family until it was our turn. That commitment to do something about it. And so I first kind of jumped in when I was right out of college in 2001, and things were different then. The crisis wasn't any less intense, but the movement was that much weaker. And I don't think we had formed bonds across survivors of different types of gun violence. We hadn't brought together, gun safety advocates with medical professionals, with educators, with community violence professionals, and kind of really form that cohesive unit. And so what I saw when I first got into this movement was really the gun lobby in charge. I remember how they said that with the election of George W. Bush, they were going to work out of the West Wing, and they did. They were able to pass laws to protect the gun industry, to give them more protection than any other industry, to hide data from public view, to not make a single dime in investment in community-based solutions, to let the assault weapons ban expire, really setting us up for what has become kind of 2 decades of acceleration of this crisis. And I think, that's the moment we found ourselves in was that kind of escalation when there was the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary. And by that point, Ruth, I had stepped back a little. I kind of had gone to law school and was practicing at a New York law firm. And I'd stayed involved with New York-based organizations doing community work in the places I grew up where there was gun violence. But, in that moment, I actually felt hope. And I was in a different stage. I had 2 kids at that point, and I felt the hope, not just for what happened in Connecticut, but for where I grew up in Brooklyn and my family and all the people I've met. And when I saw leaders just say they couldn't do anything about it, it was a real choice point for me, and I know for lots of others this is the point to either lean out or lean in. And I know so many people on this call and the people and I know leaned in, and for the last 10, 11 years, we've been building at the local level, the state level, thinking about gun violence more broadly than a single incident, but about a continuing crisis that happens every single day, concentrated in communities. When it comes to interpersonal violence and spread amongst the country when we think about things like suicide, which makes up the majority of gun deaths. And I think for 10 years, we saw work happen. And then when there was a horrible shooting in Buffalo, New York, and then in Texas, we finally saw another moment for action. And that time, instead of people leaning out, we saw people lean in, and we passed the first gun safety law in 30 years. And that felt like such a pinnacle, right? It's like the thing that I had talked about with my aunt and uncle that we would get done. But then all of a sudden, the kind of question is, what do we do next? And to this president's credit, he said, we're not just going to, say we're done here. He said, we're going to double down. And so he decided Greg and I actually, both Greg Jackson, who you'll meet in a second, I get this phone call of so, you've been asking for an Office of Gun Violence Prevention. We're going to create one. And I thought to myself, well, that's incredible. And then I said to the person who called me, I said, well, that's incredible. That's wonderful that the president's taking that action. And they were like, oh, yeah. And we hope that you'll consider working there. And that kind of completely blew me away and felt overwhelming, but also felt like it was the chance to not just be advocating, but to be doing. We've been moving for 7 months ever since. And I know, Ruth, you want me to get into the work, so I'll pause in a second to hear what your follow-up questions are. But I can tell you, when I sat in the Rose Garden with Greg on my right and my 2 kids on my left, and the president 1 row up, talking about creating this office, I thought about how 20 years before that, the NRA claimed to be working out of the West Wing. But now we had gun violence survivors and gun policy experts actually working for the White House in the first ever Office of Gun Violence Prevention. And to me, that is an arc of progress and of success. And it doesn't take away from the tragedy that we see every day and the scars we carry with us from gun violence, but it shows that we can do something, we can do more. and we can fight for the solutions that we know work. So I guess Ruth, that's my introduction, but kind of you tell me where you want to go next.
Yeah, thank you for that, Rob. I really appreciate you sharing your background, but also your personal connection to this work. And there are so many folks who do come to the work of gun violence prevention because of the ways their own families and their own communities have been impacted. And so I'm grateful to you for all of the work that you've done throughout these years and for sharing that experience with us. And we've not had much of an opportunity before to work together ourselves, but I'm super excited to see this as the beginning of a partnership, and really excited to learn more about the work of the Office of Gun Violence Prevention that has clearly been such a transformational moment for this country, as you touched on. So I would love it if you could spend a few minutes really outlining what the goals of the office are and help us understand more about what you are working on.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I think the goal, so this president has taken more executive action on gun violence prevention than any in history. We signed that law that I mentioned, but I think what he wanted and what this office represents is a true all of government approach to this crisis, where we're not in the business of trying to solve a crime at a time, but in fact to put in place the preventative measures that will lead to a safer tomorrow. And so he wanted a team and an office that sat in the White House, that our director reports to him. So we're literally kind of a step removed from the president. We're overseen by the vice president and get to work with her on a regular basis. And so he wanted a kind of leadership team to then work across agencies, to be pushing for solutions across the board, not just on the gun violence that grabs headlines, but on the gun violence that happens every day, kind of in our homes with domestic violence, in our communities with community violence, and then with firearm suicide. So that at the big picture was what he wanted. But then he kind of gave us 4 key tasks to really focus our work. The first was to implement his prior executive actions and the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, the law that passed in 2022. He said that we have to maximize the benefit, especially of the law that was passed, because that's how we can get to the next step forward. Is we show that when given tools, we can enforce the laws on the books and make real difference. And so that law, I think it happened the same week as the Dobbs decision, and so there was probably a lot of people who didn't focus. They kind of wondered, well, how big a deal is this? And as we dug in and we got to work on every single piece, what we found is just an incredible body of tools, not just improvements to our gun safety laws federally, but also $15 billion in resources to invest in solutions. So that really kind of takes the president's approach, which is we need to invest in people. We need to kind of invest in the places where violence is happening, while also looking at how do we shut down access to firearms for those in crisis or who might harm others. And you should, like when we're in rooms, like we did this roundtable with police chiefs, and we talked, it was about violent crime, but he kind of went right to how are you working with the community? Tell me about the community-based organizations that are doing this work. And so he's just a true believer in that approach. And so with this law, we really focused on that kind of approach of investment on one hand and upstream accountability on the other. And what we've been able to do is we've rolled out, there was $1 billion in that bill for school-based mental health. And what we've turned that into is the largest pipeline for school-based mental health in this country's history. We're on pace to hire and train 14,000 new school-based mental health professionals. This money went to every single state. It's dedicated to high-need schools. It's meant to get those ratios back in balance, because we know that a school counselor that's responsible for 500, 600 kids just can't engage. So this is meant to both give money to create pipelines as well as fund schools to hire. We have the largest investment in community violence intervention in history, right? The president made clear, one of his early executive actions, that 26 different grant programs could support community violence intervention, which is key. But now with this, we have the first dedicated single stream of dollars. So we've been able to create the Community Violence Prevention Initiative, which funds state governments, city governments, community-based organizations, pass-throughs to get dollars into community that are doing the work, while also funding technical assistance providers, those who actually can go help. So not everyone is recreating the wheel, and we can spend time researching implementation and the things that will make the programs that we know work better. So we've done focus a lot on investment, but also we've got all these new tools that we've used. For example, a couple of weeks ago, we made the largest expansion in background checks since 1993. And in Massachusetts, that might not feel like a big deal because you have background checks at every gun sale, but in a lot of the country, they don't, right? And that's where illegal guns come from, right? We did the president required, and we've done an analysis of gun trafficking investigations. And what we found is the majority of guns involved in gun trafficking investigations start with these unlicensed dealers, individuals who are selling guns for profit online or at gun shows or flea markets, right? The gun show loophole, you all closed that, but that's still open in lots of places. And this regulation that was just a couple of weeks ago is making it crystal clear that if you're engaged in this business of trying to make profit, right? If you're out there with a table full of guns at a gun show, or you're putting ads online, well, you're going to be presumed to be in this business. And so now we actually have clarity to say we're going to crack down on what we estimate to be about 20,000 individuals who are out there selling guns for profit without background checks, without licenses. So that literally can mean the difference of tens and tens and tens of thousands of background checks being run that wouldn't have been run otherwise. And we released that right around the mark of the Columbine shooting. And I thought back to how those shooters used the gun show loophole to get the guns. And the survivors like Tom Mauser were pushing to close that loophole for so long. And if we had this regulation, and they fought to try to close it in 1999, and they couldn't get it done. And I thought about, well, if this regulation had been in place for that long, we're talking about over 1.5 million background checks that would have been run that weren't otherwise. Like, that is just a significant kind of enhancement. But that's not the only piece. We have the first kind of law to enhance our background checks for 18, 19, 20-year-olds. So we actually aren't just using a database, we're calling into states and local governments to get information about juvenile history that's concerning. And it doesn't create a federal crime to have juvenile history, right? It's not creating those consequences, but it blocks a sale. And what we've seen with this new enhanced check is an increase in denials for the 18, 19, 20-year-old population by 25%. And the things we're finding are like just incredibly concerning, right? It's an individual who's been involuntarily committed to a mental health hospital to get treatment just a few weeks before trying to buy a gun. So we have just focused in on implementing this law and doing all that we can to ensure that the things that were put in place are actually being maximized. The $750 million for implementing state crisis intervention programs, especially red flag laws, are actually being used for that purpose. And when we went down with the vice president to Parkland, Florida, to walk through Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School and bear witness to a school that was unchanged from the day of that shooting, down to the blood on the floor. When we walked out, she challenged states to be using those dollars. She said, only 6 of the 21 states with red flag laws have started using it. I can tell you, and I'm happy to tell you, Massachusetts is a star student. You got your program plan in, your budget in. You're like one of the few states that we held up as a wonderful example that are using those federal resources. But since that moment, and with our focus on it, what we've seen is we've doubled the number of states that are now using those dollars. That was like our first big bucket of work, and that's just required a lot of work with the agencies and a lot of digging in, and honestly a lot of pushing, right, to make sure that we're doing all we can. The second thing he asked was come up with new ideas. And so, this is a place that we come to this. Like, I was at Everytown for Gun Safety for 8 years before this. Greg was at Community Justice Action Fund. Like, we came with ideas, but we need more ideas. So what you see work, what Massachusetts has done really well, we want to know about, because he said, I want you to work with every single agency. So, we showed up for our first day, which is in the Rose Garden, which was like overwhelming that's how you start a job. It then got a little less overwhelming on that Monday when we spent the day just doing HR paperwork. And Greg and I were like, oh, this is just a job, right? Like, who's my beneficiary? Where do I need like a check sent? And so that was funny. And so we're just like, oh, this is just a regular job. And then like, it becomes surreal again when that evening, honestly, the job was like 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. every day. But like that evening, what we heard was there's going to be a cabinet meeting in 1 week. And the president and vice president are going to challenge the cabinet secretaries to contribute, to do all they can to be part of the solution. And they said, we need all your ideas. And so we had to generate that first week kind of 100+ ideas for each, ideas for each agency on how they can be doing more. And so we've been leaning in with each of those agencies to kind of work through different things, from improving the data collection and infrastructure to prioritizing funding to doing more on secure storage, and to crack down kind of on where the problem is, which is kind of upstream. And so just a couple of things I'll note, because I think there are opportunities to collaborate, is we had the first ever federal secure storage campaign, and the Department of Education just released, new materials, and the U.S. Secretary of Education had a town hall of principals and sent a letter to every principal and district administrator in this country saying, this might not feel like your job, but leaning in to talk about secure storage with your community is your job, because these are the guns that youth are using to hurt themselves. 80% of youth suicide, it's a gun from the home. 3 out of 4 school shootings is a gun from the home. 75% of accidents, it's a gun from the home, and 1 million guns were stolen from private gun owners the past 5 years, right? So like, these literally are the guns being used to kill our kids, right? The thing you bring home for protection is in fact the thing that is used to harm the person you love most. And I say that as someone who's both lost someone, like I mentioned, but also with a father in special forces who grew up with guns and hunting and understand that tradition and respect that tradition, but also know if you're not storing that gun responsibly and securely, the risks are so high. And so those are new materials that this administration pushed out. And not only did the secretary send letters to every principal, he sent kind of materials so that they can more easily communicate. And, we could use your help following up with principals and district administrators to make sure they're actually sending out these materials, right? That we're actually, pushing this and having these conversations about secure gun storage in community. The other thing we've done is go upstream to think about, well, where are guns coming from? Well, one place is rogue gun dealers, right? And so, the president has what we've done is have a zero tolerance approach for willful violations of the law by gun dealers, and a focused kind of inspection regime on those who are closest to the gun trafficking problem. And, I can tell you that there's been over 200 licenses revoked in the past 2 years, which is the highest total in 20 years. So, we really are stepping up and focusing on kind of that source of firearms. Another kind of example is the guns that circumvent the whole system, ghost guns. And there's been a lot of great work in Massachusetts on ghost guns. But, what we were able to do was actually put in place a regulation that's focused on those companies, right? If you're in this business of selling these gun parts that can be readily converted, and you're making them, you're marketing them, you're profiting from them, well, then you need to be held accountable for how they're just converted, and you got to act like anyone else in this business. And so that's been a massive body of work. It's coming up with new ideas, and that's where we could just keep them coming, keep sending us ideas, keep sending us, telling us what used to be working. The third thing was to work with kind of state and local leaders and build partnerships. And so, in December, we had the largest, actually, this is what it says about our issue that we're all here for. There was the largest in-person convening of state legislators. This administration was on the issue of gun violence prevention. That was the issue that people wanted to come for, right? And they came and we packed into a room and we released what's known as the Safer States Agenda. Honestly, Massachusetts is doing very well. At least I have my chart here. We've marked everyone down. So we have a nice report card. Massachusetts is doing really well, but not perfect yet. I know you're working on a big omnibus package, so we're happy to encourage and support as that's moving. But we've really been leaning in with governors and state legislators and offices of gun violence prevention to help work on solutions, investments, and evidence-based solutions, gun safety policy, and just being supportive in our role. We plan on doing the same thing with cities and working with cities. We're convening and want to work with city offices of violence prevention as well as state offices. We just think that ecosystem is so vital to kind of the next chapter of this movement. It is not just having a kind of siloed approach to this crisis, but having leaders at our state government and our local government who are thinking across. And that's why it's great to see Christine here from the state office, but we need that ecosystem, right? We need to be able to think across agencies, because that's what this demands, right? There's no single solution. There's no single agency can get this done. It has to be data-driven and multifaceted across, education, labor, yes, justice, health and human services, right? All of it combined. And lastly, the president kind of said to us, you need to build a true response system to this crisis, because he saw Uvalde and Buffalo and too many times that the federal government wasn't stepping in to respond to gun violence the same way it did to natural disasters. And you kind of put it blunt, like, we need you to be the FEMA for gun violence. And we don't have those resources yet. And this isn't authorized by Congress, but Greg in particular has been leading the development of this incredible new program that is all about how do we respond, not just to the individual survivors, but for the community trauma that ripples out. And that's how do you help schools reopen? How do you make loans to small businesses? How do you make sure that the right mental health supports are there? And how are you actually thinking about recovery much broader and further than when cameras leave? And in that also was the president, because he knows pain, wanted us to be much more thoughtful about recovery. And so we've been working to modernize and make more equitable the Victims of Crime Act, so that we've gotten rid of the restrictions that kept those funds from getting to the people who saw violence every single day. That we were really leaning into solutions like trauma recovery centers and mental health, because we know exposure to violence can lead to violence. So we have to be kind of intervening in communities that are seeing it with mental health, with support, with resources, not with prosecution necessarily. And so those were the 4 big buckets we had. And now that Greg's here, I'm very excited, because I don't like doing this on my own. I don't like doing anything on my own without Greg. But those are the 4 big buckets. That's how we've been leading in. We're happy to talk about any of that work or any issue, or dive in any direction. But hopefully that gives you an overview of kind of what we've been working on the past 7 months. Like I said, I think this doesn't happen without leadership from the very top. And that comes from, for us, it's the president and vice president, but it could be attorney generals and governors and mayors. And that's the leadership we need to actually create the systems to actually get this work done in a really kind of big, bold, and different way. And to me, like, if the first chapter to end where I started, Ruth, like, if my first chapter in this space was that 10 years after my cousin was killed and seeing just how little we did, and the next 10 years was building to show that we could make change federally, I think this next chapter is showing that we can just make such a tangible difference, not just in laws, but in lives. And we're seeing that with what's happened the past couple of years, where with the largest investment in community violence intervention and in person-focused gun violence prevention, with strengthening our laws and going after rogue gun dealers. What have we seen? We saw gun violence spike during COVID, but then last year we saw an 11% decrease in homicides, the largest decrease ever. The first quarter of this year, we've seen another 20% decrease at our cities. So we are seeing finally the strategies that we should have been investing in for years, but haven't. As we do invest, we've seen them pay off. And so now is the time to accelerate and double down on what we know work and not back away.
Thank you so much, Rob. And I think you really gave us an incredible overview of the immense amount of work that you have been doing over the past several months. So I really appreciate you sharing all that information with us. And I also want to pause and just take a moment to welcome my friend, Greg Jackson. Thank you for joining us, Greg, and really excited to have you here. I want to give you a chance to introduce yourself and say a little bit about the work you've been doing with the office, but I also wanted to share a bit of appreciation. Greg is no stranger to Massachusetts and the advocacy work here, and was incredibly supportive to the coalition in many ways, including when we were advocating for American Rescue Plan dollars for violence prevention here in the Commonwealth, which was a long, involved, but ultimately very successful piece of advocacy. So I just wanted to start with a bit of gratitude for all of the care and concern you've already given here in the Commonwealth for the work that is happening here. And I just want to give you a chance to say hello and introduce yourself and a little bit about your work.
No problem. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Ruth. That meant a lot. And look, I can't take any credit because you all have been leading the charge on so many different policy changes, but also in investments. And specifically when it comes to community violence intervention, a lot of folks may not give you the credit, but Massachusetts is one of the major architects of a lot of the solutions that we're pushing out across the country. And so it was just an honor to be a partner with you all and to be able to add a little bit of wind to the sails as you push forward to keep saving lives with all of your amazing expertise. And I know Rob talked a little bit about our Safer States agenda. We actually looked at every single state and created a report card. And when we got to Massachusetts, we were like, ooh, We don't have much to judge over here because y'all are on it. So no one's perfect, but you're definitely a shining star, and you make even California jealous at the event. So please keep up the tremendous work. Just a little bit about me. I come to this work as a survivor of gun violence as well. Unfortunately, I was shot and nearly killed in April of 2013, which pushed me into this space and started as just an outspoken activist, but then started working with local youth in my community, working at the city level to help implement violence prevention and intervention strategies, and then quickly realized when my family friend was killed in Greensboro, North Carolina, how imbalanced the resources were and the policies were to help communities. And so that's what pushed me to focus more on national change, recognizing that that's the route to ensure that every community gets the resources they need, and not just the cities and states that are most enthusiastic or most organized. And so proud that work is bearing fruit. On the investment side, we have a lot to be proud of. I know Rob probably covered most of it, but prior to this administration, there was $0 for violence prevention programs beyond law enforcement. And now we're in a world where there's around $12 billion. And so that is a huge change. And it's also, I think, a huge reason why we're seeing so many reductions in inner cities. And we take a lot of pride in that. And one thing that Rob, I'm sure may have said or may not, but last year we saw the sharpest decline in homicides in American history, with a 13% reduction. And as bad as things have been, that is really encouraging and promising, especially when you think about what that looks like, because we have only invested resources. A lot of the major policy changes that we fought for and have won nationwide are still being implemented. So we are in the beginning of what we think is a real turning point in the lives being lost to gun violence. And so we should cherish this moment, recognize it may not feel great knowing how many people we've lost. And I'm sure we all have people that we're close to, but recognize that this is kind of a huge momentum shift. And it's only happening because of the really amazing activism and advocates from across the country that put so much pressure on local, state, and federal leaders. And so I'm just proud to be a part of this moment, but also just recognize the stakes are higher than ever, and we have to move with urgency every day. And frankly, the president believes that too. And that's why he put Rob and I here. We weren't here. I think if it was just a shiny thing for media hits, we probably would have rolled in either much earlier in the administration or maybe much closer to the campaign. But I think he really rolled us out as soon as he could, knowing that there's a lot left to implement and a lot left to change before this last summer of this first term. And so we're excited to be here in that sweet spot to be pushing all these policy measures forward. So thank you. I know Rob did a phenomenal job. He always does. The great Wilcox. So definitely here for Q&A. And thank you again, Ruth, and everybody in Massachusetts.
Amazing. Welcome. And thank you again for sharing your personal background and connection to the work and some of the things that you have been working on. And I'm struck by the scope of the work. We talk at the coalition about the importance of policy change and sustained investment in community-based solutions, really listening to data and talking more about implementation. It's one thing to pass legislation. It's another thing to implement it and implement it well. And it's really interesting for me to hear the lens that your office has on really seeing legislation and practice through to make sure that these changes are effective and reaching the folks that need to be reached with it. So thank you for sharing that information with us. And I'm going to ask just one question, and then we'll get to some of the questions from the folks in the audience, because I know that you have a very tight timeline. So I want to make sure we can get to as many questions as possible. But I would love it if you could reflect a little bit more on your work with the states, because we know that what states do matters greatly. And even specific to Massachusetts, while we have been a leader in gun violence prevention, what are the things that you're hoping to see from Massachusetts and from our coalition that will really help move this work forward?
Great question. So we make sure that you have the Safer States agenda after this so that you can see kind of how we laid it out. But, I know that you're working on the Commonwealth, working on a big omnibus, which has a lot in it, which is exciting. When we took a look at the kind of things that we were tracking, legislation on ghost guns, on gun industry accountability are two big things that we didn't see Massachusetts having on the books. We also know that I think continuing to invest in solutions, right? And the offices that have been set up at the state and local level in community violence intervention and community-based work that's happening on the ground. And honestly, a real focus on trauma recovery and putting trauma recovery centers in the places that are, suffering in violence, and we're ensure that we're funding and easing access to resources for survivors. So, I think those gun policies, ghost guns, and gun industry accountability are one. I think two is kind of really making sure we have dollars flowing to the people doing really good work at kind of the intervention work. And then three is looking hard at, our victims assistance resources actually getting to the people who are suffering crime, right? The states are the ones that run VOCA, not the federal government. So while we're working on changes at the federal level, it's up to the states to really implement that and make sure that those dollars are getting to the right place. So that's, I think, so there's the resource for survivors, but also that structure, so trauma recovery centers and kind of a real ecosystem around helping people in the community where there's trauma are just a few things I'd mention. But, I think like that's the thing about this issue is even when we succeed, we're still failing because people are dying. And so even with Massachusetts making so much progress and having gun violence rates that are just remarkably lower than other places in this country, we know that there's still work left to do. So I appreciate you asking that, Ruth.
Greg, did you want to jump in on that? Rob covered it. You guys do this together a lot, I suspect. Amazing. Why don't we get to some of the questions from the folks in the audience, because I know people are really excited to meet you and hear about your work. And I'm just going to go through a couple of them, and if either of you want to tackle them, that would be terrific. One of the questions was, depending on how the election goes in November, which I know a lot of folks are really thinking about, do you have thoughts about what can be done if things don't go well with being able to really maintain the work that you are doing and the progress that's been happening? And how are you both thinking about that?
Yeah, well, this is how we put food on our plate, so we think about it a lot too. But I will say we try not to stress about it too much. I mean, I think the big thing is we know that we're moving forward life-saving policy and life-saving solutions and resources. And while, the existence of this office may be up in the air, a lot of the policy changes are really hard to reverse. I mean, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act is law. And the way that it's implemented it will take legislation to reverse. So we're very confident in that. And that's why it's so critical that we're here when we are now to ensure that all of those pieces are pulled together. And frankly, there's a lot of implementation steps that would have been lingering out there if we weren't here as an office. But now we're in a position where we can get it fully implemented well before the election. So I think that's huge. Rob talked about the executive actions. I mean, there's nearly 40 executive actions, many of which make small changes, but small changes in writing, but major changes in process that we're working to implement. And again, it would take quite a bit of work to undo that. I think the other thing is with our emergency response work, what we've seen is that the most conservative and moderate of folks, when they see the resources we can deliver, they appreciate it. And I think we're kind of starting to shift how people think about responding to emergencies and seeing it less as a political move and more as a resource to support people who are in need. And we saw that in Lewiston, Maine, where we supported families. Many of the families, unfortunately, who suffered loss were Republican and were not major fans of the president, but they were in pain and trauma. And when you have an administration that can help you with your funeral costs and help you with your family and takes time to make sure your business is reopened, that makes sure that your streets are functioning, that puts in emergency dollars. I mean, over $6 million in emergency funds to staff up victim supports. And when the president of the United States flies into town, refuses to do any media and spend 4 hours sitting down with families, it is really hard to continue to push back against them for political policy reasons. And I think that's the beauty of our work, is that we're not necessarily just, duking it out with Congress every day. We're delivering real resources and services to communities that are in need. and they appreciate that, and they're willing to let their members know. And we've seen, even with the office, when they tried to defund us during the appropriations battle, 8 Republicans voted to support us. And that was without any lobbying or advocacy, because they saw the value of our work to serve people, and not just push political agendas per se. So I think that's what's most important, is we're just focused on implementing as much as we can, doing great work, and then frankly, telling the story of how it's saving lives, and then trusting that Democrats and Republicans are all equally committed to saving lives. They may have different approaches, but if we can break through in our messaging in that way, then it should sustain, hopefully, our efforts, if not the future of this office.
Thank you for that. I really, particularly as I think Greg, I'm a trauma clinician by background, and really speaking to the importance of attending to trauma and showing folks the importance of that, and really honing down on that core value of no matter how you feel about the politics or the policies, we should all be able to agree that saving lives and caring for folks after trauma is really important. So thank you for speaking to that. I would love to jump into another question because I want to be sensitive to your time. There was a question about increased funding for research into best practices for gun violence prevention. So I'm wondering if you can speak to what's happening in the research funding landscape right now.
Yeah. So I agree with what Greg said last question. I just want to make sure we're not political. We are not advocating for the election or in any way. I just want to make sure we always give that disclaimer when you have a question that does touch on the election. Research and data, those are places that we leaned in right away. And we have some really exciting things coming down the pipeline that hopefully we'll be announcing soon in those spaces. But it's a huge value. I think a few thoughts about research, Ruth, and I appreciate how you kind of shared your experience when you asked the question. But in 2013, so there's been like 3 big moments when legislation almost got passed, right? 1999, I mentioned, after Columbine, it was about the gun show loophole. 2013, after the shooting at Sandy Hook, it was about background checks at gun shows and online, right? Those are important policies, but they are just kind of very focused, and they're only kind of one type of solution. And one of the things we saw, and then by 2022, the law we passed, we were talking about, it doesn't just have all this funding, but it has a provision that addresses the boyfriend loophole, right? And closes that, and suicide and community violence and mass shootings, right? So how do you get there? You get there because we actually started investing in research. And I've said that before. I did it pure and simple, like in 2013 and 2001, 1999, like there weren't enough researchers on this issue to like fill a conference room. But this year there was a conference that had, I think it was like 700 or 800, you might have been there, with researchers together talking about kind of this field that has grown. And that is incredible. And I think one contribution was we finally started seeing federal dollars flow towards research. Not nearly enough. It's actually pales in comparison to what we need, but it signals and creates a stream that supports those in the field, but also what we've seen is folks pile on in a really positive way. We've seen philanthropy lean in. We've seen nonprofit organizations really build out research teams. And we've seen universities dedicate like whole departments to this issue, right? Johns Hopkins, UCal, University Davis, Rutgers, University of Michigan, Maryland, I'm leaving some out, but like University of Washington, and so this ecosystem has been growing up. And I think with that has come better insight into this crisis and the various solutions we need, which actually then led to better policy. And so we're committed to, and we were able to secure, $25 million again for research. But we know what we've been trying to do, honestly, is we've already put together an interagency working group, all the different agencies that have a stake in the research space, to figure out how we can be doing more, right? Both looking at what we've accomplished, but thinking about what more we can be doing. And we're looking to pull together a number of different research convenings this summer to help not just showcase the work, but help inspire those who've entered this field who are kind of younger and come with new ideas and are representative of the communities that they're serving. And so, this is a space that we just think is kind of vitally important. So we both need to be funding research, we need to be showing what we've been learning from the research, and we've got to be making improvements in data. Because for too long, we just haven't had timely data on gun violence or really good visibility into non-fatal injuries. So we've been pushing forward in all of those spaces, and hopefully you'll see from us over the next few months some new announcements in these spaces.
Amazing. Thank you. It's very exciting to hear. I know that you have a hard stop early, so I just want to be sensitive to your time. Do you have any more time for questions, or do we need to let you get on to the rest of your important work for the day? One more question?
We could take a couple more, and if Rob needs to jump early, that's fine. I can stay until 1 o'clock.
Okay. Yeah, same. Our 1 o'clock meeting got canceled, so we have
okay.
more time.
Excellent, because we do have some more questions coming in from the folks in the audience. And so one question was about supporting grassroots organizations with financial stability, sustainability, and I'm wondering how you're working. You've talked a lot about investment in community-based solutions, but we think a lot at the coalition too around particularly smaller, more grassroots organizations that are just either haven't been able to access funding before or are newer and doing innovative things. So if you can talk a lot about how you're supporting those grassroots and smaller organizations with their resources and stability, that would be great.
Yeah, well, I think it's something that we all can be better at as a government. We are pushing pretty hard to ensure that smaller groups that are just getting started are prioritized. And not just because they're innovative, but because we've seen there are entire regions of the country where a lot of these solutions have never been built before, right? Looking at places like Jackson, Mississippi, and Birmingham, and El Paso, Texas. Like there are new communities that Albuquerque, right? There's new communities that have been suffering from violence that want to launch community-based strategies and community-based organizations to address violence, but don't have the history or the infrastructure or the training. So what we've been doing on our end is trying to push to make sure intermediaries are an option where they can be, so that maybe you are a grassroots group, but you can maybe partner with a university or partner with a United Way or partner with the city to make sure that resources are still being drawn down. And so we've been trying to ensure that those are an option wherever possible. We've also been pushing on the agencies to provide more training and resources, both virtually and in person, specifically the Department of Justice with their Community Violence Intervention and Prevention Initiative. They actually hired 2 technical assistance contractors, one that's focused on current grantees to ensure they have the support they need to implement the strategies that they applied for, and also to handle the reporting and all those things. But then the other one is really focused on those who have not been grantees yet, whether they've already applied or if they've reached out with interest. And so there's literally a contracted team that's working with newer organizations on how to best prepare their applications, how to prepare their infrastructure and their tax status in order to be eligible. And so that's a really great model, and that's what we're pushing for in other agencies, to ensure that they have people on their team that's focused on new applicants and not just focusing on the legacy applicants. But I will say there's still a ways to go. The last thing that we're working on is trying to make sure that the resources that are available are more transparent and easier to find. For example, with Department of Justice, we pushed them to roll out what's called their program plan. And now you can see every grant, all 230 of them, 220 grants they offer this year, $5.8 billion. You can see it all in one place. And you can see, what it looks like, how much money is it, how many awards are they offering, when is the deadline to apply, when is the forecasted deadline if it hasn't opened. So you can say, oh, okay, it's coming in June. Let me start preparing now, and a small description. Similarly, you can also look at DOJ and look at their awards map. And now for the first time in this administration, you can look back and see, okay, here are the people who received it in 2023, 2022, 2021. And you can also click and see a brief description of what they're doing with those dollars. So for newer groups, you can kind of go back and look at the paper trail to get a sense of who's being successful and bringing in resources. And then you can look at the full landscape of what's available with the Department of Justice. And so we're working with Department of Health and Human Services to do a similar approach of looking back with the awards and looking forward with the resources. And if we can get those two big agencies on point, then we can continue with that momentum, looking next at Department of Labor and Department of Education. And our ultimate goal at some point is to have one place, like a single stop shop, where someone who's interested in preventing violence in their community can come to one place and see all that the government has to offer across agencies. But for now, we at least have the largest agency as transparent as it's ever been with those two tools.
I think this is like such an important question. The other thing they've done on top of what Greg said, which is important, is they understand that's an issue. And I think like all the grant making bodies need to say it and understand it and problem solve it for. So one of the things they're doing that they've done on top of what Greg said is they structured this grant program, which is $100 million a year, into 3 different buckets, really. One is for state and local governments, right? Because they're repeat players, they're comfortable in the system, but they're very different than your community-based organizations, which is another bucket. And that's like, they are their own category. And then the last category, which they've been very intentional about, because it can be abused, but been very intentional about it, is how do you create kind of pass-through organizations that are the intermediary that then will fund a number of smaller groups that could not apply on their own, do not have the back office capacity or the kind of experience, but you can use this pass-through model to get dollars to those smaller entities. And they've been, like I said, they're very intentional, because that's, you know, in other spaces, not this one, those organizations maybe take too much, or they don't give to the right local organizations, or they actually have no connection to the community or the issue. So you have to be very careful in that. But if you are careful and you are trying to achieve that stated goal, Ruth, I do think that's like a really interesting model. But that's how they've kind of implemented how the dollars go out to try to solve that. But it starts with actually naming that as one of your goals. Like, one of my goals is to help smaller nonprofits that actually would not traditionally be able to apply for my federal, state, or local dollars, or philanthropic dollars for that matter, right? In any of those spaces.
Yeah, thank you for that. Again, it really gets into the implementation piece. It's one thing to have a policy or a piece of money become available, but how do you actually implement it well, decrease barriers to access, and make sure that the folks who really can be using those funds in community are aware and have access to applications and all of the other resources they need to be competitive for these grants. So thank you for that. Another implementation related question was going back to ERPO, which you talked about before. And folks wanted to hear a little bit more about how you're reaching judges, law enforcement, the important stakeholders who need to really understand how this law works in order for it to be implemented well.
Well, so I think we were fortunate to, in the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, get the first kind of federal funding stream that can go to implementation. You know, I think as you're thinking about implementing that law in particular, doesn't self-actualize like other laws. You really have to be intentional about how you use it, when you use it, what you combine it with, right? Like, just removing firearms from someone when they're in crisis doesn't actually necessarily get all the way there. But I'll share, this is like one of the most important policies to me, because it's the policy that literally could have saved my cousin's life. The individual who shot and killed her, she was home on break from Haverford College, just checking people into the front desk, and she was shot and killed by a patient who stopped taking medicine and was in crisis, who just walked in and he killed her on the spot, and others in this small town. And you know, it's just one of those other mass shootings that happens that no one reads about except for the family and the community, right? But the saddest part of the story that I think is hard to get over, and I know my aunt and uncle haven't, is his brother was a deputy sheriff and like wanted to take action, tried to commit him involuntarily and couldn't, because that standard was too high. He knew he had guns and he shouldn't, but there was no tool. And so my aunt and uncle they had been donating to the Brady campaign for years before that for other people. And it turns out that it was for us. And so they dedicated themselves to getting these laws passed. They worked to pass 70 laws in California. And so like when my aunt testified in the Senate Judiciary Committee in 2019 at the invitation of Lindsey Graham, which actually helps you build that bipartisan. She was able to share these stories and these experiences and talk about how you can always give someone that firearm back, but you can never give that life back. And so implementing these is so critically important to know when to use them, how to respect due process, how to execute them. And that takes, as you said, the courts and law enforcement and family members, trusted advisors. And like the places we've seen this go really well, you have local champions, right? Who, like Mara Elliott in San Diego, and honestly, the sheriffs in Florida and in Washington State that are devoting resources to actually implementing these laws, right? Real people whose job it is to do HERPO intake. But at the federal level, with these new resources, what we have actually is the first federal funding stream that can go to doing all these things, right? Policies, protocols, trainings, public awareness. But we got to use it. And fortunately, Massachusetts is, right? So Massachusetts has pulled down $5 million and it's putting it to work with HERPO implementation. There'll be more money coming available this summer that hopefully Massachusetts pulls down. And so that was part one, is get resources so states actually won't say, they don't have to choose between priorities. They have resources they can use to build all that. The second is we funded and launched the first ever national Extremist Protection Order Resource Center. And that's like just, I mean, to think about how far we've come as a movement is like, we actually now, as Greg said, we have community violence intervention specialists funded by the federal government to do technical assistance. We have a national resource center on extremist protection orders. Like, these things aren't like hypothetical anymore. Like, we in fact are building them into, as you said, Ruth, the implementation of our laws. And so with this resource center, what we can do is create kind of that community of learning among the states so that they can share challenges, they can share best practices. There's tools that don't have to be recreated, and you can have efficiencies about, you know, taking protocols and best practices and public awareness campaigns and repurposing them. So I'm just really optimistic that the states are finally, with the vice president's help, getting them to pull this money down. We have this resource center up and running, and we're like fully going to lean in to make sure that, you know, these tools are used appropriately but effectively to save as many lives as possible.
Excellent. I'm going to end with one last question that is really more of a request, and then really end with some gratitude for everyone here. But there was a question around what the office can do to support our work with continuing to strengthen policies here in Massachusetts. We have this omnibus bill that we are determined to get across the finish line by the end of this legislative session, which will be on July 31st. So if you have any super quick thoughts about what your office might be able to do to support us in that work, that would be terrific.
On the omnibus, you should tell us. We could do a follow-up call. It's kind of, where is it in the process? Who needs to hear from us? How can we be helpful? Like, we know that you're closer to it than we are, but we're certainly here to help. And I know there's a lot in it, and I obviously haven't kept up with exactly where things stand. So we'd have to know exactly what's going on and where things stand and where it is. But we've done that across the country. We've had phone calls with legislators and governors, and you know, been just tried to lend weight and support and help accelerate, you know, these critical changes. So I don't know if this call probably isn't the right place to do it, but we'd love to be in touch to hear how we can be helpful.
Amazing. So I think what we're ending with is an invitation for continued partnership, which is very exciting. And we really feel like those partnerships between local organizations and folks doing the work on the national level are really powerful. So, you know, Greg has been an old friend of the coalition. Rob, you're a newer friend, but I suspect we'll have more opportunities to collaborate and work together to make sure that we can make our policies and practices here in the Commonwealth as strong as possible and save as many lives as possible. And on that note, I do want to end with some gratitude. Thank you so much to Greg Jackson and Rob Wilcox for being with us today, for sharing your work, but also for the incredibly transformative work that you are doing. If any of you follow the office on social media, you know that these two people are everywhere 24/7. I don't know how you're keeping it up, but I think I can speak for everyone in this space that we're just incredibly grateful for what this office is doing and for all of the energy that you are putting into it. So thanks for spending some of that time and energy with us today. So if we can end with just a round of applause for our guests today, and thank you so much for all of your efforts and for being with us.
Thank you so much for having us. This was great, and look forward to seeing you all soon. Save some of those lobsters for us. And thanks again, Ruth.
Thank you so much. And for everyone here, if you've not yet signed up for our team for this Sunday's Mother's Day Walk for Peace, the coalition will be walking to support the work of the Louis D. Brown Peace Institute and to support their work transforming responses to homicide. So please do join us. And we look forward to seeing everyone soon. Amazing. Thank you, Rob. Thanks, everyone.